Okay, hello everyone. My name is James Ritson and I am the product expert for Affinity Photo. I'm going to show you how to take a basic raw image and completely transform it using various compositing techniques and blending in different imagery. So let's get straight into it. I'm just going to share my screen, which hopefully you can all see nice and clear now. So, okay, we are going to start with this, where it's a fairly sort of bog standard landscape photograph I took a couple of years ago when we went up to Northumberland for a weekend. And we're going to end up with something a little bit like this. So a reasonably dramatic transformation. I won't, dilly-dally too much with kind of like the background or anything like that. But if you're kind of new to compositing, or you're interested in compositing, but you've never really known how to stuck into it, what I'm about to show you will probably be a great primer. So, in an ideal world, I would be able to, travel across the globe and collect all kinds of different imagery to use in my compositing projects. But in reality, that doesn't really happen. So, stock imagery is a great way to kind of pull in resources and, help fuel your imagination in terms of compositing ideas. So, what I'm going to do is drag my raw file into Affinity. Okay, so we start off in the developer persona. That's basically the workspace for developing raw files. Yeah, I'm not actually going to do anything to this really, since all of our work will be non-destructive via layers. I might bring the black point slightly to the left just to raise all the tones away from pure black, but that is about it. So I will click develop, and there we go. That was probably the quickest raw development demo you've ever seen. But now we can really get stuck into the whole compositing aspect. So the first thing we're going to do is cut out the foreground and separate it from the background. And to do this, we're going to use the selection brush tool on the tools panel here. I prefer to use keyboard shortcuts. So to access this, I can use W twice to get across to that tool. Then I just want to paint into my foreground like so, nice and quick, just to create a rough selection of the foreground detail. Okay, hopefully you can see the marching ants here. Now, we probably wouldn't need to bother too much in this image, but if we want to be perfectionist about it, we've got some little foliage details here that haven't been included in the selection. Some of the fence posts here as well. So we're going to matte our selection, and the way we do that is by using Refine on the context toolbar up here. Okay, if you've never used selection refinement before, it's really, really easy. You basically just click drag around areas that you want to matte. Okay, it's great for fur and hair and all that kind of difficult detail. However, in some cases, we don't really even need to do any manual matte brushwork. Everything is kind of done for us, as we can see here. Those fence posts are now included, and up here, all of those little foliage details have been matted for us automatically as well. So we don't really need to do anything. That's great. Now, on the Refine Selection dialog, we have an output choice here. Now, this is really important if you're doing any kind of cutout or compositing work. New layer and new layer with mask, they will perform something called color decontamination. And that's really useful. So basically, I'll just explain this. Obviously, when you make a selection, a cutout of a foreground, you've got the background to contend with. And in this case, our background is basically a blue sky. What color decontamination does is around the edge pixels, it disregards the color contribution from the sky, the background, the sky. So when we end up with our final cutout, we won't have like a visible blue halo around the cutout detail if we use new layer or new layer with mask. If we use selection or mask, Affinity Photo doesn't produce a new pixel layer, therefore it can't modify the pixel details, if that makes sense. Whereas when we use new layer, for example, it can. So it can actually modify those edge pixels so that they don't have the blue halo from the sky detail. That's basically a kind of a roundabout way of saying, if you're doing any kind of really, sensitive cutout work, always use one of these two options. So let's go layer. Okay, that basically creates a new layer for us with just the foreground. So we'll rename that. We've got our background pixel layer as a backup here. That's the original image, but we won't need to refer to that, hopefully. Okay, so now we're going to start putting in our composite details. I've got my first sky image here, so I'm just going to click drag and place that into my document. That needs scaling up quite severely, so not a problem. We use V to get to the move tool, and then we just snap it to the edges of our document here, like so, and we position it behind the foreground pixel layer. Now you can drag drop on the layers panel. You know, I could drop this beneath, that's fine. What I prefer to do though, just for expediency, is use keyboard shortcuts. So Command on Mac or Control on Windows, and then left and right bracket to move layers up and down the layer stack, like so. Okay, that's looking about where I want it, I think. So yeah, we're going to start looking at colors and tonal blending now. Now, I want an apocalyptic, otherworldly feel to this image. So I'm going to start using adjustment layers. I will use a white balance adjustment, first of all. And I'm going to clip that into the sky layer here, just by offering it to the label or the text of the layer. Then I release the mouse button, like so. Let's drag the white balance all the way up and drag the tint up as well. Okay, we're starting to sort of redden those tones. Let's go for a bit more, you know, drama and mood. So for that, I'll add a brightness and contrast adjustment. Maybe raise the brightness slightly and raise the contrast almost all the way, something like that. Okay, and then, you know, I want to give this sky a bit more interesting texture. So let's get a second sky layer, which is going to be this thing here. You know, and drag this in. Okay, again, V for the move tool, just to reposition this and scale it up as well. And in order to kind of layer this over as some sort of texture to the original sky, we'll just change the blend mode to overlay. Okay, this is quite dramatic, and it gives this, you know, it kind of converts this into sort of like a celestial theme. So while we're here, let's intensify the red apocalyptic tones a little bit more. So above the two sky layers, I will place another white balance adjustment. And we'll just bring the white balance and the tint up just to redden those tones even further. Look at that. That is quite dramatic now. Okay. So at this point, we want to think about blending the foreground in. Obviously, you know, the background and foreground do not match at all as of yet. So one easy way to do this when we're kind of doing like extreme color shifts is to use something like a recolor adjustment with a blend mode. So I will add a recolor adjustment, clip it into the foreground pixel layer here. I might change the hue slightly just for a sort of an off-red color tint. Bring the saturation down, maybe to about 25% nearabouts. Raise the lightness slightly just to brighten the foreground, and then we want to set the blend mode. So again, experimentation is key here. For example, we could try something like multiply. That's perhaps a little bit too dark though. So what about overlay? I think this will give us a nice balance. Yeah, okay. So in addition, you know, don't forget the very straightforward brightness and contrast adjustment. So let's add one here. We're still clipped into the foreground pixel layer because we had recolor adjustment selected. So that gets added straight above it, which is great. You know, it's isolated into that foreground pixel layer. We'll just raise the brightness and contrast slightly, like so. In fact, I'll take the brightness down because we're going to do some brush work. Now, I suppose you could call this non-destructive dodging and burning. That's one you know, approach for it. What I like to do is create a new pixel layer. Get the brush tools, the paintbrush tools. So that's B on the keyboard. Across on my brushes panel, I'll just choose a nice soft round brush. And I'll set my active color to white. So on the color panel, you can toggle between these two here, or you can use X on the keyboard to quickly switch between your primary and secondary colors. So I want white. I want an overlay blend mode for this pixel layer, maybe an opacity of around 50%. Let's try that. And I'm just going to paint into just the areas of the castle and the foreground here. That's perhaps a little too strong, especially on the castle. I feel like I'm kind of, not quite overexposing, but blowing out some of the highlight details here. So we'll just take the opacity down a little bit. Not a problem. Okay, a second pixel layer, I think. This time I'll use my keyboard shortcut, so Shift-Command-N on Mac or Shift-Control-N on Windows. That adds a second pixel layer. This time we'll set the blend mode to multiply and bring the opacity down to about 25%. Set our color to black, and I'm just going to paint into the foreground areas here, just to darken them slightly. So let me just show you the before and after for this. If I select both pixel layers and hide them, you can see originally, this is kind of like the tonal distribution of our foreground. And now we've effectively performed some kind of relighting just by using a couple of pixel layers with blend. Okay. Right, at this point, I'm thinking the castle might need to be a bit more prominent in the image, so I'm going to increase its size. This is, depending on how things go. This is either going to be fairly straightforward, or we're going to have to get a little bit more involved with some masking. So, easiest way to do this is to get the selection brush tool, that's W, again, on the keyboard. I've got to make sure soft edges are turned on up here. Soft edges will anti-alias the selection after it's been created, which is really useful if we're not using selection refinement, which we're not in this case. So I need to make like a rough selection of the area that I want to increase the size of. Let's just snap these areas back down like so. Just need to go in here and make a more detailed selection. There we go. Okay, so now I will duplicate this by using Command J on Mac or Control J on Windows, then deselect, so that's Command D on Mac, Control D on Windows, you know the drill by now. V for the move tool, and I'm going to hold Command on Mac, Control on Windows, whilst resizing to bring this up quite significantly. About there, I think. Or perhaps, you know what, perhaps let's take it even further. Okay. So now what we're going to do is blend this in, because obviously as it stands, this doesn't look very good. We've got some obvious seam detail here, and yeah, we need to do some further work on this. So what I can do is add an empty mask holding Alt or Option whilst clicking on the mask layer option on the layers panel. So I'll just highlight that there. Hold Alt or Alt Option whilst you click. Okay, that adds an empty mask. So that cutout layer that I've just made has now disappeared. What I can now do is use B for the brush tool, switch across to white, and then paint in the areas of the mask that I want to reveal. Okay, so as I'm doing this, I'm just having a look, because we might need to just subtract away from that. We might need to get a little bit more involved with a bit of a textural mask. Don't know yet. Let's have a look. So I'll use X to switch across to black and subtract away from this detail. Okay, yeah. So when you have difficult masking scenarios like this, you might kind of come up against the limitations of a soft round brush. If I try and kind of brush into this, maybe it doesn't look so good, that sort of thing. So across on the brushes panel, we've got this masking category that I pretty much stay on all the time. Now this has got the soft round brushes, but it's also got a couple of textural brushes with what we call like a randomized nozzle. So like the rotation and maybe the scale will vary between each brush stroke slightly. And this is really useful. So if I just select that, make sure I'm set to, I believe it's black, to subtract away. Yep, there we go. So let me zoom in so you can really see this in detail. So using like a randomized textural edge is really, really useful sometimes, because it gives you that kind of, how best to describe it, like that kind of organic, granular feel to the blending, as opposed to kind of like like a soft round edge, which sometimes doesn't really look very realistic. So that's my advice. If you're struggling with, masking details and that sort of thing, try using, in Affinity Photo, we have this masking category with these two randomized textural brushes. We also have like a texture category up here, which has some nice variations that you can experiment with as well. But regardless, whatever image editing software you're using, if it's got a decent brush engine, it will have like these textural brushes with randomized nozzles. Always give that a go, because you might be surprised at how effective it can be for this type of blending. Okay, so let me show you the before and the after. So that's looking quite nice, yeah. The great thing about all this is it is non-destructive. So, at a later date, if I want to go in and revise that mask, I can do. Okay. At this point, I feel like the background is perhaps missing some extra detail. We're perhaps missing a bit of drama from this scene, which is not something I thought I would say. But luckily, I came prepared with a comet. So let's just place this in. I'm going to position it beneath the two foreground layers just by using Command and left bracket. I'll put it roughly here, I think, and then set the blend mode to something like screen. Okay. Again, this doesn't get rid of the blending entirely. That's quite an obvious seam there. So what we can do, like we did with the foreground, is hold Alt or Option, click on the mask layer to add an empty mask, and B for the paintbrush tool. We've still got that randomized nozzle. So let's see, where's our, okay. I'll tell you what, let's switch over to a nice soft round brush, and we'll brush in, we'll just sort of block these areas in for now. And then I think we'll go in with a textural brush to get rid of all of these additional sort of bright areas around the main comet trail. But for now, let's blend this comet in as well in terms of color. So we will use a recolor adjustment layer, clip that into the comet layer, so just offer it to the text here. I think that will actually do. Perhaps we just want to increase the brightness and contrast as well. So let's add a brightness and contrast adjustment, bring that contrast up for a nice punchy, bright looking comet. Okay, and then we can sort out this masking. So let's select that mask again, B for the paintbrush tool. Let's X for the black. We'll paint away some of that more extreme detail. Then we'll go in with a textural brush up here. And what I'm actually going to do is, that's too strong. So I'm going to take the opacity of my actual brush down. Now, a quick way of doing this, rather than having to use the context toolbar up at the top left here, is to use keyboard shortcuts. So for example, if I wanted 20% opacity, I could type 2. That set my opacity to 20%. So now I can just kind of gradually blend that away in a nice subtle fashion, as opposed to, the kind of like the brute force, it's either there or it's not approach. Something like that. There we go. Yeah, okay, I think that works. And just to add even more intrigue to this image, let's duplicate this comet. So Command J on Mac, Control J on Windows. V for the move tool, we'll just reposition it slightly up here as well. Let's scale it down as well, just slightly, like so. And just for a bit of variation, I think we will change the recolor adjustment slightly. Let's give it a slightly different orange tone. Something like that. Yeah, okay. All right. Looking at what we need to do next. Let me think. Yeah, okay, so let's just add a little bit of glow underneath the comets. So I'll select the white balance adjustment underneath my two comet layers, get the ellipse tool here. I'm just going to draw out an ellipse holding Command or Control on Windows to draw it out around the center point. Let's go roughly here. And we want to pick off one of these tones. So across on the color panel, I'm going to click drag and sample this color. Click here to assign it to the ellipse. On the effects panel, we'll add Gaussian blur all the way up like so. Set the blend mode of this layer to overlay and just rotate it slightly. And perhaps just bring it down as well, like so. So if I just kind of hide that, you can see that all it really does is add a bit of like a background glow or like a kind of a base for these two comets to sit on. It's kind of subtle, but sometimes we put in all these little flourishes as they add up and they help blend the different images together. Now, speaking of blending images together, this is still really lacking because we need to try and help these elements sit better in the scene together, you know, the foreground and the background and also these two comets. Now, this is a really kind of like it's a bit of a cheat, really, this technique I like to use. I will add a new fill layer. So this is basically just like a, you know, a non-destructive color fill, and we can add a gradient to it. So it selects the gradient tool for us, which means all we need to do is just draw out our gradient like so. Okay, and for colors, I'm going to select the bottom node here, and I think the bottom node wants to be, let me see, something in this ballpark perhaps. And the top node needs to be much brighter, so we'll almost max out the red and then just have like a slight reddish white tint to it, I think, something like that. Okay. Now what we do is set the blend mode to something like screen. I mean, we can experiment, you know, it doesn't matter. We'll go for screen for this example. This is far too strong, so we'll take the opacity down to about 50%. I can use 5 on the keyboard to achieve this, as opposed to having to get my mouse over here and scrub the opacity slider. This adds a kind of misty overlay to the image. We just need to counteract this loss of contrast. So for this, I'll use a curves adjustment. That's Command M on Mac, Control M on Windows. Okay, and then I just kind of need to bring this down, push these tones up a little bit, like so. Okay. Now, if I just hide these two layers and show you the before and the after, it adds a little bit of mood to the scene, but more importantly, it kind of lifts, you know, these darker areas, and it creates more of an even tonal distribution to the whole image. Now, to help actually balance out these tones, because we've kind of added a bit of a red color cast, we can use various adjustment layers. So, for example, I might add a color balance adjustment. Excuse me. And on the shadows, I might drag cyan and red to the left slightly. That kind of neutralizes that, you know, that red tint a little bit. Perhaps drag magenta and green up and yellow and blue up as well. And then across on the midtones, I might just drag cyan and red down slightly and push yellow and blue up. Okay. It's starting to get there, yeah. In addition, let's use something like selective color. And for this, we can, on the reds, maybe just take some of that cyan contribution out here and push the yellow up slightly. And across on neutrals, perhaps magenta down. Oh, maybe not too much, actually. I don't like the green color cast that's adding. Maybe take yellow down as well to get a bit more blue in there. And across on blacks, maybe bring yellow up just to kind of take the blues away slightly from this area here. You can see as I increase the yellow contribution, we just kind of get rid of that blue color cast here. So this kind of adds a little bit of a slightly different mood or tone to the image. You know, these two layers together, you can see the before and the after. So, you know, we've kind of counteracted the negative aspects of using that fill layer earlier and got some of a kind of like a more neutral color tones back. Okay, I think I'll do like a final crop. So that's C for the crop tool. Okay, let's just bring this in to roughly here I want a nice sort of a square aspect ratio for this, and just to kind of, focus the attention more on these, like the rock in the foreground and then the castle up here as well. Okay. I might do some final sharpening as well. So amazingly, I haven't actually used any live filters yet. I usually sort of pepper my work with them. Live filters are one of Photo's really cool features. Essentially, they allow you to apply filters, as you can see on this menu here, but non-destructively as layers instead. So the easiest way to think about them is adjustment layers, but instead they apply filter effects. So for example, if I wanted to sharpen non-destructively, I could add an unsharp mask live filter layer, just drag this out to the top of the layer stack here, and then just zoom in, set my radius to maybe 1 pixel and the factor to 2. Okay, that gives us some nice fine detail sharpening. So far so good. Okay, and yeah, I think that's pretty much going to do it for my edit. The great thing about just having this non-destructive layer stack though is, look at all this, not once have I had to merge my changes together. I haven't had to convert anything to a smart object. I haven't had to, compromise editing flexibility. In fact, if I just turn all these layers off, you'll see I can get right back to my original image. So all of this is completely non-destructive. For example, I might want to just turn off the sharpening for now. Perhaps I might want to go into that foreground layer and scale it up a little bit more, just to see how that looks. And then, of course, use the masking. So that's another important aspect to note about Affinity Photos layer transformation. In fact, the Affinity apps in general, actually, is that basically any layer transformation, scaling, rotation, shearing, that type of thing, is all non-destructive. So I can go in and scale this up with no loss in quality whatsoever. I don't have to kind of commit my transformation destructively. Okay, and then of course, I can go on and save this document and come back to it at a later date and perhaps revise, some changes, that sort of thing. I might try without the color balance adjustments, or perhaps go in and change the curves adjustment slightly. There's no limits really to what I can do. So I do believe that takes me to the end of the edit. I will just zoom out to see whether I'm happy with the tones at a smaller scale. I recommend doing this especially, if you output a lot of your work to social media like Instagram, Twitter, even your websites, where people aren't going to be looking at your images, full screen, as it were, or at this kind of size. Just zoom out, have a look at your image. Does it need any kind of further tonal tweaks to make sure everything's kind of legible? Can you tell at a smaller rendition what this image is about? Can you tell it's, this apocalyptic scene with comets flying past the castle? Actually having a look at this, maybe I might want to move these comets slightly so that they're more visible at a smaller scale. All these little changes. Anyway, I will leave it there because, like anything, it's possible just to kind of fiddle and ruin things, take them too far. You know how it goes. So, thank you very much for watching this. I will now my screen sharing. And I'm just going to check on the presentation and see if there are any questions that I can answer. So, let me just come through. Oh, right, there are a few. Yes. Okay. Let's see. Nigel, yesterday you introduced me to luminosity mask control. I'll click. Do you have any more info on how to use this? Yeah, I mean, actually, I can quickly show you a few things. So I'll just, I will share my screen again very quickly. So yeah, I remember. So it was the command option click, right? And that creates a layer, a selection based on luminosity. So this is great for, when you want to just use adjustments or other techniques to affect literally just the luminosity or the brightness information in your image. It kind of tends to slope towards the highlight detail at the moment. We can, of course, invert this if we want to, manipulate the darker tones. But the idea is to kind of exclude color detail entirely from the tonal manipulations. For example, if I add a curves adjustment, just straight off the bat, we're affecting red, green, and blue channel information cumulatively, okay? So when we do things like, we bring all this down, we affect the relative intensity of the color information as well as the brightness. Now, luminosity masking helps kind of, separate these two entities. There are other techniques we can use as well, however. So, for example, we could use a luminosity blend mode, which has a slightly different rendering. So at the moment, this is just normal, we're affecting RGB data. If we set the blend mode to luminosity, notice we have a bit of a change here. So let me just commit that. Okay, and I'll see if I can undo it. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so it's quite a subtle change, but see what happens here. So this is normally when we're affecting the red, green, and blue data all together, yeah? So you see we affect the intensity of the colors. And then when we set the blend mode to just luminosity, so it's only affecting the relative perceived brightness of the image, notice that our tones desaturate slightly, but the actual brightness does not. So that's one approach. Here's another interesting one. If anyone works in lab, there is a bit of a performance penalty for this, just to be upfront about it, but you can actually switch across to a lab color model without having to convert your document to lab. So if you're in RGB or CMYK, for example, you can toggle the color model here. And what lab does is it separates, it works on color opposition theory, basically. So it's more akin to how our eyes perceive tone and color. So we separate into lightness and then A and B color. So lightness, we can actually go ahead and tweak that. And again, we're not touching the color detail at all. So that is there's multiple approaches that you can take really for kind of making tonal decisions based purely on lightness or brightness without involving color detail at all. Okay, I think I'll have to leave that one there so I can get to some more questions. What does matte mean? What is it? Yeah, so basically matting, if you've ever done any kind of motion graphics work, green screen work, that kind of thing, I suppose another term might be like anti-aliasing, if we think about it that way. So effectively, it's kind of like semi-transparent pixels. So when you have edge detail, if you just had hard-edged pixels on the edges, it wouldn't look very good. It would look all jagged and so on. And so what we do instead is we have pixels that are semi-transparent on the edges. And matting is kind of like the way of determining those edge pixels. So you have your foreground, you have your cutout information, which is all the sort of the solid pixels, and then right at the edge you have these matted pixels. So they're anti-aliased, they're semi-transparent, and it's kind of like the way to determine that semi-transparency, the blending there. Can we view this video later on to try it? Yes. I'm not sure on the time frame, but it is past a certain threshold. I think perhaps at the end of the day, you can just go back and rewatch it. Can you save all your layers to work on at a later date? You absolutely can. Yes. I will just show you this quickly, just because it's sometimes nicer to show. So let me turn on all my layers here and I will save this document. So we save it as a native AF photo file, composition. We do also have PSD import and export. And also for anyone who likes to use DAM software like Capture One or Lightroom, we support layered TIFF right back. This is actually a great workaround for people who maybe don't want to involve our own file format, the Affinity file format, in their workflow, in their infrastructure. So instead what you do is you pass a TIFF file to Affinity Photo, and any layer work you do will be written back to that TIFF file as EXIF data or TIFF layers. So whilst your DAM software might not know how to interpret them, it can still preview, the final image. But when you bring that TIFF file back into Affinity, the layers are still all there for you to work with. So that's a nice kind of like middle ground compromise. Anyway, sorry, I digress. Yeah, so I've just saved this as composition, and we can go to the desktop open this file back up, opens pretty much instantly, and there is our layer stack ready to be manipulated again. Okay, I'll just come back off screen sharing, and Tim, so similar to the question above, these will be available later on to watch through the Venue IQ software website. Stuart, how can a comet be in front of the clouds? Good question. It's fantasy. That's my excuse. Going off topic, Richard, is there an Affinity version of Lightroom in works still? If there is, there's nothing that we can commit to publicly at this point, and the kind of the attitude that we're taking is, you know, if you're aware of the Affinity apps, we have Photo Designer and Publisher. We've just released version 1.9. Version 2 is up next, and we want to kind of pour as much energy into solidifying the key 3 apps, you know, our trio or suite, before we kind of divert our attention off to other things. I mean, you know, for those who are aware, Serif, or we make the Affinity software, we are a small team, very small team, relatively speaking, compared to other software companies. So we have to be very careful and very clever about, you know, the resources that we allocate to, you know, each app development. So whilst we would like to produce one, we can't commit to absolutely, you know, saying that yes, we are working on it right now. But obviously that is our hope. But you know, there are other alternatives in the meantime, and we have, you know, there are ways in which we can develop workflows around them. So feel free to ask about that. And yeah, I mean, I'll come back and look at these questions later as well. So, is there anything Affinity? Maria, is there anything Affinity can't do that Photoshop does? So, Affinity, is there anything Affinity can't do that Photoshop does? I mean, yeah, take your pick. There are probably a ton of things that Photoshop does do. I mean, you know, we don't do anything 3D related at all, for example. That's kind of an open-ended question, unfortunately. We have generally found that, you know, as we've approached more and more sort of corporate clients, and as we've added more functionality, you know, we are getting there in terms of, you know, having all the functionality that people require. I mean, the other thing is basically that, you know, in the sense of workflows and so on, sometimes the functionality that you needed in Photoshop, you don't necessarily need in Affinity. I'm talking about things like smart objects. The problem is I could go on for, you know, hours about all this stuff. It's difficult to answer. I mean, I suppose the thing is, you know, what I'd recommend is download a trial and see for yourself whether it has the kind of functionality. And then we have support forums. I monitor those as well, especially for photo related questions. So if you're really unsure about whether to, you know, something can be achieved, you're always free to ask there. I do all the learning material, the tutorials as well, and there's tons of those. So there's plenty of information to look at later. Let me see. I think we're almost caught up. I think, yeah, we're almost at time as well. Got like literally a minute left. Oh, there's loads more questions. I think I'm going to have to try and address some of these, not part of live Q&A, but just in the chat, I think, because I've got to round it off now. So I will take a look at these now, and I'll try and respond to as many as I can. Okay. So, yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in. If you're interested in Affinity Photo, or even just the Affinity Suite, do check out our website, and there's tons of training material, loads of videos on YouTube and our official website that are all produced by in-house product experts like myself. We're really proud of that. We try and keep all of this stuff in-house. And it's you know, we kind of put ourselves out there as like, you know, this nice personal, approachable feel to the company. And I hope that comes across. So thank you very much, everyone. And I will sign off now. Appreciate you all tuning in to watch.